Hi everyone. One of my viewers asked me to walk through all the different settings for the E-M5 Mark II and what are the best settings to use, especially if you're just getting started. So my focus is going to be on just general photography, not any kind of specialty like HDR or bracketing and birds in flight type stuff. I'm just going to show you settings that I would use if I was just going on a regular photo walk or if I just want to take pictures of family and friends and I want to get the most out of this camera for that kind of photography. So let's get started. All right, first let's start with the exterior of the camera and look at all the various buttons and dials on it because we will be changing some of the default features of these buttons and dials to better suit our needs. All right, let's start with the biggest dial on the camera, and that is the mode dial. And the mode dial basically tells the camera how to shoot. And there's basically three modes you can shoot in. You can shoot in a photo mode and its variations. You can shoot in a movie mode, or you can get access to some of the special features for photo mode. And essentially, the photo modes start here with auto, then P, A, S, and M. And then we have our special features like the art mode, scene mode, and some kind of collage mode. And then finally we have a movie mode. And we're going to reprogram some of these functions on the mode dial in the menu system. But just to quickly go over, let's start with auto mode. This is the mode where the camera does everything. Controls the autofocus, controls the exposure, controls the color profile. And I don't recommend using this mode because a lot of times it won't give you the result that you were looking for. The only time I would use this mode is maybe you're handing this camera to the waiter or waitress to take a picture of the group. A lot of people don't know how to use a camera, so put it in auto mode and it'll probably be okay. Now, if you're just getting started, P mode is not a bad mode to start in, and this is known as program mode. However, program mode is very similar to auto mode in that it will control the exposure, but you can have control over the autofocus modes, the color profiles. So if you want to shoot in black and white, you can do that in program mode. And you also have a little bit of control over the exposure with exposure compensation, meaning if you want to make the picture a little brighter or a little darker, you can do all of that in program mode. So this is not a bad place to start. But for this video, I'm going to recommend you start in aperture priority mode, where you have control over the aperture in the lens. And I have videos that go in a lot of detail about aperture priority mode, which is what A mode is. But basically, this gives you control, the most creative control over your images. So if you want a shallower depth of field, meaning you want like that blurry background, or if you want to get things more in focus, like if you're doing a landscape, aperture priority will allow you to do that. All right, the next mode is S mode or shutter priority mode, where you take control of the shutter speed, then the camera will take care of the aperture and ISO to get the correct exposure. And this is typically used in sports action type photography, where maybe you want to freeze the action of a person running or a bird in flight or kids playing, and you choose a shutter speed faster than the camera might otherwise normally choose in any of the other modes. And I do have videos on aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode that I'll put links down below that goes into a lot more detail. And in this video, we're not going to be using shutter priority mode, but that's what it's for. All right, the next mode is M mode or manual mode, and this is where you take full control of the camera's exposure settings like ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And this is typically used in flash photography or astrophotography and a multitude of other types of very specialized type photography. And I'm not going to be going into manual mode in this video much, but this gives you the most creative control over your images. And I think as you advance in your photography, you definitely want to learn how to use manual mode or how to shoot in manual mode. And I'll cover that in another video. Now the next setting is movie mode, and this allows you to take more control over the various settings when you're recording video. And I don't recommend using this either if you're just getting started because you can record movies on this camera by just pushing the record button. You don't have to put the mode dial into the movie mode. And I'll talk more about this when we get into the menu system, but for the most part, you can ignore this for the purposes of this video. All right, the next setting is some kind of collage mode. This is where you can put images, like you can take 3 or 4 shots and put them into the same frame. This is a special function that, again, I'm not going to cover in this video, and you're probably never going to use anyway. And in fact, we're going to reprogram this particular feature on the mode dial to do something else, and we'll get to that later. Scene mode is very similar to full auto, with the exception that you can tell the camera the intent of your scene. So for example, you can tell the camera, I'm going to be shooting a portrait. So in scene mode, you can set it to portrait, and the camera will try to give you the best settings for doing portraits. Or you can tell it you're going to do landscapes, and it'll make adjustments to do landscape type photography. And I don't recommend using this either. And we're going to be reprogramming this particular button as well to do something else. All right, the next mode is art mode, where you can choose various art filters for the camera. And we're not going to be messing with this too much either, but me personally, I do like to use some of the art filters built in the camera, like the grainy black and white or diorama or dramatic tone. They're kind of fun to play with time to time, so I suggest you experiment with the different art filters built into the camera, and you might like some, you might not, maybe you think it's a gimmick, but that's what that's for. All right, and that brings us back to full auto mode. So you can see why the mode dial is the biggest dial in the camera, because it dictates everything else you're going to be doing with the camera, and it actually even changes some of the functions of the buttons and dials on the camera depending what mode you're in. All right, let's take a look at the rest of the buttons and dials on the camera, and we'll start with the function buttons, and they're labeled here. Function 1, which is on the back of the camera. We have function 2 over here, function 3, and function 4. And by default, they're set to access certain features of the camera. They can be reprogrammed as well as some of the other buttons and dials, but by default, this is set for highlights and shadow adjustments. This is for your JPEGs. This is your EVF and live view toggle, so you can switch between your EVF and your live view or have it automatically switch, and I'll show you how to do that. We have the HDR functionality, and there's different HDR modes that we can set as well. And then function 1 by default is set for AEL to lock exposure. And then we have our front and rear dials, which typically control exposure compensation or aperture or shutter speed. Again, it's going to depend on what mode you're in on the mode dial. And then on the front, we have another function button here that's not labeled. By default, this is set, I think, for like depth of field preview. We're going to reprogram this one. And then this is the lens release button here. And then on the back of the camera, we have our function lever button, which can be programmed to do different things. And then we have our menu, info, trash, and play button. These are fixed. These cannot be reprogrammed. And then we have our D-pad here, which can be reprogrammed just a little bit. And then we have the OK button, or like enter button. And then finally over here we have a diopter dial to help us get the EVF in focus when we look through it. And just to be thorough, there's a few other things on the camera. If you look underneath this flap here, we have a standard 3.5mm microphone jack. We have our HDMI output port here, and then we have a proprietary USB port. And so you'll need the cable that came with the camera, or you can order one. But you can't just use any USB cable. And this is for like updating the firmware in the camera, or offloading the settings from the camera and save them onto your computer so you can retrieve them later. And you can even offload the images from the camera through the USB port, though I don't recommend doing that. So you'll rarely use this port except really to just update firmware. And then on the front, we have, I think they call this a PC sync port. This is for really old school type flash photography. So you would remove this cap and plug a PC sync cable in. You'll probably never use this, so just leave the cap on. Here's the LED illuminator light. This is for giving you a little bit extra light to help you with autofocusing. And we're actually going to be turning this off, and I'll explain why when we go into the menu. And then of course this is the memory door here to access the SD card. The battery door. We have some pins here. You might still have the cover for this, but this is for attaching like accessory grips like this one here, which I use a lot actually. I like the grip that comes with, or that you can get for this camera. And then the tripod socket here, standard 1/4-20. And then finally we have the hot shoe port here. This is how you would normally do your flash photography, by attaching a flash or a radio trigger, etc. And then of course, last but not least, is the on-off switch. All right, now let's get to the good stuff and the actual settings in the camera that I recommend you use if you're just getting started. So the first thing we'll do is put the camera into aperture priority. Again, this is so that we have the most creative control over our images. And then going to the back of the camera, we can confirm we're in aperture priority mode because we have the giant letter A here in the bottom left. Now I've done a full reset on the camera so that we can all be on the same page. And if you go into the menu, you may see a little info box pop up that tells you what this particular line item is for. And this can be useful when you're just getting started, but you can also get in the way. So let's just go ahead and deactivate this so you can see everything. But if you want to see it again, you can just hit the info button again, and this toggles the little information box on and off. All right, so we're going to start here in shooting menu number 1. So you do that by going all the way over to the left and just moving up to shooting menu number 1, and then click over to the right. And the first line item here is your card setup. And this is pretty straightforward. This is where you format your memory card. You may see an option there that says all erase, which means you probably have pictures on your memory card already. And doing all erase will erase just the pictures, but leave other things that might be on the memory card intact. So generally speaking, if you're going out and shooting, I recommend you format your memory card from scratch so you know you're starting with a clean slate. And then the next line item here, the reset Myset. This is where I actually did the full reset of the camera so we could all be on the same page. But I recommend you make sure that you have the reset set to basic and not full. Because the difference is basic just resets sort of the exposure settings and picture profiles, some very, very basic things to kind of get you back on track with your settings in your camera. But if you do a full reset, it's going to erase everything on the camera back to basically its factory defaults with a couple exceptions like your copyright information. But this is also going to erase any customizations that you did and any settings that you did deep diving into the menu that we're going to be doing later. So the only time you really want to do a full reset is when, for example, there's something grayed out in the menu that you want to use and you can't figure out why it's grayed out. You'll probably have to do a full reset on the camera to get it back to its default settings and then rebuild all of your settings from there. Or there's an option to save all your settings in Olympus Workspace, which I may do in another video, but generally speaking, just make sure that your reset function is set to just basic. All right, now the next 4 line items are your Mysets, and this is where you can save customized settings in the cameras, and you have up to 4 slots. So you can save customized settings for, say, just normal photography, everyday stuff. You can set up something for sports action photography or maybe for landscapes, but you have up to 4 different settings, and I'll show you how to program these because we're going to be saving everything we do today to Myset number 1. All right, let's go back to the shooting menu number 1, and we can pretty much ignore the rest of these settings. I mean, the defaults are fine, but mainly because we can access all of these settings through the Super Control panel, which is really the preferred way to access changing picture profiles or picture modes or shutter settings. The only exception here is the digital teleconverter, which you can turn on and off here. This particular feature you can assign to a button anyway. So again, I wouldn't worry about setting anything else in the shooting menu number 1. The only thing I really use in this menu is the card setup and the reset Mysets. All right, let's go into shooting menu number 2. And I'm not going to talk about all of these special features here like bracketing, HDR, keystoning, but I do want to talk about anti-shock and silent settings. So let's go into here. Now it's very important that you have the anti-shock mode set to 0 seconds, because if you click over to the right, you can actually deactivate anti-shock mode, but you do want to have anti-shock on and set it to 0. There are other settings here. You can set it to several seconds if you want, but set it to 0 for the purposes of this video. And then silent mode, you also want to set to 0 seconds. And then noise reduction, in this case, for silent mode, you want to leave it turned off. This is not the noise reduction like we think about it in a traditional sense, that when we take the picture, we see noise in our image, and we want to try and reduce that noise. This noise reduction is specifically for long exposure photography. So if you're taking images that are like 30 seconds or 1 minute or several minutes long, what the camera will do is take a second image, close the shutter, and measure the noise generated by the camera, then subtract that from your initial image. But if you are going to be shooting long exposures, say 30 seconds a minute, with the silent shutter, go ahead and turn that on. It'll help reduce some of the noise and give you a little cleaner image. There's a different place in the menu to set the noise reduction for the mechanical shutter. This particular setting in the menu here is for the silent shutter only. Now I want you to take note of some of the icons in here. You'll notice next to the anti-shock we have a little diamond icon, and next to the silent mode we have a little heart-shaped icon. We're going to see these again when we go into the Super Control panel, which will indicate if we're in a anti-shock mode or if we're in a silent shutter mode. Now I want to expand a little bit on the anti-shock mode, because this camera, the E-M5 Mark II, is susceptible to a phenomenon known as shutter shock. And basically what that is when you take a picture in full mechanical shutter mode, the shutter opens and closes, and that can introduce vibrations into the camera that can show up in your images. So if you've been using this camera for a while and taking pictures, and you've noticed your images are not quite tack sharp, they have just a little bit of blur in them, it's probably because you're using the mechanical shutter and your shutter speeds were probably below 1/500th of a second, like 1/60th of a second or 1/250th of a second. I've noticed in my camera that particular phenomena, shutter shock. And it can vary a little bit with the lenses that you're using. But generally speaking, you always want to shoot, if you need mechanical shutter, you always want to shoot in the anti-shock shutter mode or silent shutter mode, which is generally how I shoot. Is most of the time I use silent shutter mode. And to expand on this just a little bit more, there are times when you do need a mechanical shutter, like if you're doing flash photography or if you're panning left to right and following a subject. Maybe it's a person running or a moving car or a bird flying. If you don't use mechanical shutter and you're using silent shutter, you might see sort of like this rolling shutter effect where the vertical lines in the background are slanted. You may even notice some distortion of the subject itself when you're using silent shutter mode. And mechanical shutter mode mitigates that almost completely as well. So now let's get out of the menu and go into the Super Control panel. And I'll show you the settings I recommend you use there. And then we'll go back into the menu again and do a little bit of fine tuning. All right, to go in the Super Control panel, you just click on the OK button, and the Super Control panel is touch sensitive, so you can quickly jump to a setting that you want. Personally, I prefer just to use the D-pad. I feel like I have a little more precision this way. And then the changes setting, when you're in that box, you just rotate the front dial on the camera, and it'll change the setting to whatever you want. For ISO, I recommend you just leave this on auto, and we're going to go in the menu and make a slight change to that and tweak it a little bit. For white balance, again, auto white balance is fine, but we're going to make a little change in the menu for that as well. And then these two settings here are for shifting the white balance slightly. So if I want to make the white balance a little warmer or a little cooler, I can play with this A and G sliders, or I believe they stand for amber and green. So if I show you if we click OK on A, for example, if I want to make the image a little bit warmer than the default, I can just shift this up to +2. If I want to make it a little cooler, I can go -2. Just leave both of these at 0, unless you're really good and understand color space. Just ignore that. Now over here is the picture mode, or basically the color mode or color profile that you're gonna be using. This is where you can choose like natural, which is color, muted, which is muted colors, and then there's portrait mode, and there's monotone, which is your black and white. So experiment with different ones there, but we're gonna stick with natural. And then remember when I showed you in the menu how there were additional settings for the color modes or picture modes. They're all right here in the Super Control panel. So here's sharpness and contrast. This is saturation, as identified here in the top left. I forgot to mention that. And then over here is your gradation. It's set to normal. Normal's fine, but you can try auto as well. Auto, basically what it does is tries to compress the highlights and shadows if it needs to bring those details in a little better, so you're not clipping highlights and shadows than you normally would if you were in the normal gradation pattern. Try that, see if you like it. The difference can be very, very subtle most of the time, but it can help a little bit if you're using the JPEGs. If you're going to be processing RAWs, this makes no difference. And then there's a high key and low key. High key you typically see like when people are doing those portraits of babies. It's a very bright, very high key kind of look to it. That's what high key kind of looks like. And then low key is for that very dark and sort of gritty kind of look. I use that a lot actually when I shoot black and white. I put the camera into a low key gradation where it pushes the tone curve down so that the darks are darker and the blacks are inky black. But just leave this on auto if you're just starting out, but you can experiment with these later. And then let's go down here. We have the color space, and we have two choices here, sRGB and Adobe RGB. Just use sRGB. This really only applies to your JPEG images. And if you're going to be posting your JPEGs online, everything online on the web is currently it's sRGB, and it probably will be almost probably in the foreseeable future. I don't see any workflow that you would use Adobe RGB on your JPEGs. Now for your raw images, that color space is assigned sRGB, Adobe RGB for display purposes, but you can change the color space on a raw images, because raw images technically don't have a color space. It has all the colors. There's no limit theoretically. So it doesn't really apply to raw images. There's a few exceptions because some software does look for the color space tag for display, not only for display, but also for processing raw images. And you find this in some astrophotography software, for example, and there may be others, but if you're using anything like Lightroom, Photoshop, Capture One, DxO Photolab, they all reassign the color space to a maximum or wide gamut color space like ProPhoto. So you don't need to worry about it for your raw images so much, 99.9% of the time. All right, so leave that on sRGB. This is our face detect for the autofocusing system. Just leave this off. It does work if the people are about 4 or 5 feet away from you and their face is, at least 10-20% of the screen, then, or frame, I should say. It will detect their faces, but any further than that, the face detect is pretty unreliable. So at that point, I would just recommend using the single point autofocus. And that's the general autofocusing mode I recommend anyway. So let's go into the AF area, click OK on this. And if we rotate the front dial, we can move the autofocus area around. And we can move the rear dial to go vertically. But if we click the info button, we get additional settings here. So the front dial will now control face detect to be on or off, left eye, right eye. I recommend just leaving this off. And then the rear dial is going to change the targeting area. So this is the small point, this is 9 point, this is all points, and this is a single point. And this is the mode that I recommend you use, just a single point autofocus. And if you need to, you just focus and recompose, right? So to do that, you would need to use SAF, where when you half press the shutter button, it's only going to focus one time until you fully press the shutter button. You can always let go of the shutter button and half press it again to refocus if you need to, but normally what you do is you just kind of focus, you get that confirmation beep, and then move the camera slightly to recompose to take the picture. Now this camera also has continuous autofocus, which is actually pretty reliable, but we'll need to make a little tweak in the menu system. However, the only problem is this is a contrast detect only system, so there's a little bit of pulsing all the time when you're half pressing the shutter button, and it doesn't instill a lot of confidence when you're taking the picture. You have to constantly check or chimp the image to make sure it acquired focus, and I can tell you in practice, it does actually acquire focus when you make a little tweak in the menu system most of the time, but it's not quite as reassuring as the single point autofocus when you get that confirmation beep, right? So I recommend you start with SAF, and then when you get more familiar with the camera, start experimenting with CAF and see what results you get. But let's go ahead and move on. There's the face detect. We talked about that. These are flash settings. We're not using flash, so that's why these are grayed out. All right, these are your shutter modes. Right now we're in single. So what that means is when you push the shutter button all the way down, it's just going to take one picture no matter how long you hold the shutter button down. You'll notice that this particular shutter mode is just a solid square. So this is full mechanical shutter. And I don't recommend you use this with this camera because of that shutter shock phenomenon we talked about earlier. So what I recommend is, at the very least, if you need mechanical shutter, use the anti-shock mode. And that's why we changed that setting to 0 earlier. But I prefer to use silent mode most of the time. When I'm not doing any kind of panning action, I'm just taking a picture of something, a static image or still life. Silent mode is the best. You won't get any shutter shock and your images will be a lot sharper. All right, and then there's other modes here: continuous high, sequential high silent. So whenever you see the heart shape, remember we talked about the icons. The heart shape represents the silent or electronic shutter. And these modes are like for sports action, but when you press and hold the shutter button, it'll continually take pictures at different speeds. But I recommend starting out, just use silent mode. All right, then over here is your metering. Right now it's an ESP. ESP is fine. It works, again, 99% of the time. If you need to make adjustments to your exposure because maybe the metering wasn't quite where you want it to be, like if there's strong backlighting, for example, you can just dial in some exposure comp. Now there are some other settings here for metering, like center weighted. I don't use that much anymore. And then there's spot, which can be very, very handy if you want to meter a very small area. I think this measures about 3 or 4, maybe 5% of the center area or wherever your focus point is in the screen. That's for more advanced type exposure control. Same thing with spot highlight and spot shadow. These are a little bit more advanced metering modes that can be very useful, especially if you're doing ETTR or exposed to the right or exposed to the left. And I'll do a video on these two modes specifically, talking about using these for ETTR, for example. But for now, just leave this on ESP. I can't remember what that stands for, but it's basically the camera figures out what the exposure should be based on everything that it sees. And it does a good job. All right, this box here, we'll come back to this. Let's go to the image stabilization. I recommend just leave this on SIS Auto. Basically, the camera's going to figure out where and when it needs to use image stabilization. If it detects any motion in your hand or shake, or it detects also if you're panning, it'll try to apply the correct image stabilization. However, there are some other modes here that you should be aware of. Horizontal shake IS. So if you're panning vertically up and down, horizontal IS only will try to correct for any kind of horizontal shake. So you get a little better performance out of the image stabilization for those specific situations. And vertical image stabilization is for when like you're panning horizontally. It's going to try to correct for any kind of vertical shake. And then there's all direction IS. Now, this is similar to auto image stabilization, but the difference being is that all direction IS does not detect any kind of panning motion, so it's going to constantly try and correct for any kind of shake that it detects, which could potentially work against you and introduce blurry images. So if you're shooting primarily still life, shot to shot to shot, and you're not panning or doing anything, all direction image stabilization may work better for you. But again, I use the auto image stabilization, SIS Auto, 90% of the time. I've been experimenting a little bit using all direction image stabilization, but I really haven't seen any difference myself. But just to let you know why there's two different ones. There's auto and there's all direction. There's a very slight difference between the two. And then here's our picture file modes. Like right now we have it to large, fine, plus raw. So with every picture we take, we're getting two files. We're getting our JPEG image in a large, fine format, and we're getting our raw image. And we're going to tweak in the menu system so that we get a large super fine to get the best quality JPEG image in camera. And then raw is raw. All right, the next box here is for your aspect ratio. And you can choose like 16:9, 3:2, 1:1. And I can't even read that one, but 3:4. So just leave that on 4:3. This applies to your JPEG images. It does not affect your raw images. But basically what it's doing is, let's say 4:3 reflects the entire sensor image, right? Everything that the sensor sees is going to be put onto the image file, your JPEG. But if you choose, say, 16:9, what it's going to do is going to crop off or chop off the top and the bottom to give you that 16:9 aspect ratio. So you're losing megapixels. And that's fine because it only affects your JPEG. And you can actually use this as a tool because this aspect ratio does not affect your raw images. Your raw images will always be 4:3. You will see the crop lines on your raw images, but it doesn't, you can reverse that. You can change it back to 4:3 with a raw image. Everything in a raw image is pretty much reversible regardless of the settings that you use here. And like I said, you can use that as a tool because sometimes I like to compose images in a 1:1 aspect ratio, and I'll just set my aspect ratio to 1:1 in camera, knowing that it's only going to affect my JPEGs, and I can change it in post-processing on my raw image if I want to later. All right, then the last thing here is basically a shortcut to the function buttons menu. So if you want to quickly change what the buttons do, rather than say this button being HDR, you want to change this to be focus peaking, you can do that directly from the super control panel with a shortcut to the menu button. I don't recommend doing it this way. I recommend just going into the menu in this case and changing the function button directly in the menu rather than doing it through the control panel. All right, so that's everything in the super control panel. And what we need to do now is actually go back into the menu and just do a little bit more tweaking, and then we'll wrap this up. All right, back in the menu, we're going to skip shooting menu 1 and 2 and go right to the custom menu. And we're going to go into the autofocus, manual focus menu. And we set most of the things we need here in the super control panel, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the set home. Right now it's set to do all points. I'm going to change this to a single point, and if we click over to the right, we can choose where that single point starts, but I'm just going to leave it in the center. And basically what this does is, let's say we're focusing and we move our point over here and take a picture. If we want to go quickly back to the home point, what we can do is click on the D-pad and press and hold the OK button, and it'll go right back to that center point that we chose in the menu earlier. So that's why I do that. It just gives you a fast way to get back to the center. And then, whoops, let me click OK. Yeah, now we have the center point. And then AF Illuminator, I like to turn this off because it's really more distracting than it is helpful, but it's referring to this little yellow light here that comes on when the light is low. I found a lot of times the lens I'm using covers that light anyway. And then face priority we set manual focus clutch. Okay, so I'm going to make this inoperative, but what this refers to is some lenses, they have like this manual focus clutch where if you pull it back, you can manually focus the lens rather than autofocus. And I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally engaged the clutch for manual focus and didn't realize it until I got home and saw that most of my pictures were blurry because my eyes aren't that good. But and a lot of my students have come to me and said the same thing, like, how come my camera won't autofocus? It used to. And then I would just shift the clutch back to autofocus mode, and they're like, oh, they had no idea. So just make this inoperative. But if you like to manually focus, then you would make it operative. And that's all we have there. Now let's go into the release menu. And this refers to when you take the picture. You're releasing the shutter, and that takes the picture. I like to have the release priority set to off, so it's already off by default for single autofocus, the SAF. The release priority C or CAF, I also like to turn this off. So what this is telling the camera to do is only take a picture when it thinks it has focus. So only release the shutter when you think you have focus. And that's why we turn this off. If we have these turned on, the camera will take a picture as soon as you fully press the shutter button, regardless if it has focus or not. So you'll get a lot more pictures in focus if you like to use continuous autofocus or even single autofocus with both of these turned off. And then these are the shutter speeds. So, if you want to shoot at 10 frames per second, etc., all the default settings are fine there. Image stabilizer, we set in the super control panel already. And then image stabilization, there's another setting here, but this refers to when you're shooting in one of those continuous shutter modes, like 10 frames per second. Personally, I like to have this on. That way, the camera won't take a picture unless it thinks it has acquired stabilization of the image. Now, some people like to have this off, particularly birds in flight type shooters, where they want the camera to fire off as many frames as possible, as fast as possible. So they're going to turn that off. But I always leave this on myself. If I miss a couple of shots because the camera doesn't think it has stabilization, it's okay with me. But some birds in flight people say that they get more keepers with this turned off. But for most of us, I think we can just leave this on. Halfway release with IS or image stabilization. Basically what this does, this is for user experience. Basically what it does is when you half press the shutter button while you're looking through the EVF, it stabilizes the image by turning the stabilization on. It doesn't have any impact on the image itself. It's just to help you compose. It's very useful when you're using very long telephoto lenses and you're trying to, capture that maybe bird on a stick. It stabilizes the scene so you can compose a little easier. And then lens IS priority on or off. You can leave this off. There's a couple of exceptions, and it's a case-by-case basis, but this really only applies to when you're using Panasonic lenses that have lens stabilization built in on an Olympus camera. If you turn this on, it's going to use the stabilization in the lens and turn off the stabilization in the camera. And for very long telephoto lenses, 200, 300, 400 millimeters, it may be better to use the lens stabilization. But for wider angle lenses, I say 100 millimeters or less, you're probably better off leaving this off and using the camera's in-body stabilization instead. I think it's better than the lens stabilization in the Panasonic lenses. Now, if you're using an Olympus Pro lens that has image stabilization like the 12-100 or the 300 f4 Pro, those lenses ignore this setting altogether. And what it's going to do is those lenses will sync the lens stabilization with the body stabilization to give you the best image stabilization possible. So it's completely ignoring the setting anyway. So if you're just using Olympus lenses, it doesn't matter what it's set to, but just turn it off for most cases unless you're using a telephoto style Panasonic lens. I'm not sure about the newer 100-400 lens. I heard that you can separate the image stabilization between the lens and the body, but I don't have that lens, so I can't tell you from personal experience how that works exactly. All right, then release priority, set to normal, that's fine. Or release lag time, I'm sorry, set to normal. That's just how fast does it take the picture after you push the shutter button. We're talking fractions of a second difference. I think there are reasons to use the release lag time as, what's the other choice there? Short. I don't know what it is. If you do know a reason to use this rather than the normal, just leave it in the comments below for all of us to see, because honestly I don't know the difference or why you would use short versus normal. All right, now let's go down to exposure, and in this menu everything here is fine by default. Noise reduction is set to auto, and noise filter. Now the difference is noise reduction refers to the long exposure type stuff, anything that's like 2 seconds to 30 seconds a minute. What it's going to do is take two pictures. It's going to take the first picture when you push the shutter button as normal, and then it's going to take a second picture automatically by closing the shutter, measuring the noise it reads off the sensor for the length of the exposure that you used the first time. So if you took a 30-second exposure, it's going to take a second picture, close the shutter for 30 seconds, and take another picture and subtract the noise that it finds from that dark image from your original first shot. So it's going to double the time it takes to take every single picture. And as I said before, you can leave this off. There are times when you might want to leave it on if you know you're going to be taking 30-second exposures, but for the most part I like to leave this off. And then noise filter, this refers to the JPEG only. This does not affect your raw images, but this actually does reduce noise in the image regardless of the shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 1/1000th of a second at ISO 1600, it's going to apply a noise reduction algorithm in camera to your JPEG. I like to have this off, or you can do low, but honestly, the camera, even when this is turned off, the camera does some noise reduction to your JPEG, even though that's turned off. So just leave it off. If you turn it to low, standard, high, especially high, and you're at high ISOs, the image can start to get a little mushy and soft. So I don't like to use it. If I'm going to do any noise reduction, I like to do that in software on my computer. All right, the next setting we're going to change actually is the ISO auto set, because the default setting is set to 1600, which is too low in my opinion. You can set this to whatever you want, but I like to set this to the maximum available. On this camera, you can go all the way to 25,600. And then the default, the lowest ISO you can choose is 200. So what this setting does is it gives the camera a little breathing room when it's trying to set the exposure. So for example, when we're shooting in aperture priority mode and we're using a 25mm lens, the camera is going to try and maintain at least a 1/60th of a second shutter speed, give or take, before it starts to raise the ISO. And if the ISO hits a cap of 1600 and it still doesn't have the correct exposure, at that point it's going to have to lower the shutter speed down to say 1/20th of a second or 1/10th of a second or 1/5 of a second, to the point that we run the risk of introducing motion blur, whether it's because we're hand holding and or if the subject is moving. It's just going to use too slow of a shutter speed for us to get a sharp image or an image without blur in it. So in this case, I like to raise that ISO cap up to 25,600 so that before it lowers the shutter speed, it'll keep raising the ISO until it has no choice but to start to lower the shutter speed. And I'd rather have a fast enough shutter speed to maintain or minimize the motion blur than an image that has motion blur in it at a lower ISO, because we can fix higher ISO images now with all this great software like from DxO or Topaz, etc. But we cannot really fix blurry images, right? All right, let's go back into the menu and ISO auto in different photo modes. I like to just set this to all. So this allows us to have auto ISO in manual mode as well. And metering, we set that in the super control panel. And most of the rest of these settings we can kind of ignore. Those settings we can use, I really have to make a different video for, like live comp and things like that. Flash sync, we can ignore these settings since we're not talking about flash today. And this setting here in menu G, we do want to set the image quality. And this is where I talked about the large fine versus large super fine. So what we're going to do is we have this set to large, which will give us the full maximum resolution. And then we're going to set this to super fine to give us the highest quality JPEG possible. And just as out of practice, I like to change all of these to say super fine or large super fine, like that, so that I don't inadvertently pick a lower resolution or lower image quality. So all of these are going to be set to large superfine. Now what this does in the super control panel is if we go back in there, you'll notice that it now says large superfine, but we're also going to have 4 slots here all pegged at large superfine as well. Because sometimes when I'm scrolling through, I might go past, the first one and hit the second one and just click OK. So like I said, that's why I like to change them all to large superfine, just so I don't inadvertently do something like that. But it may seem like when you're turning the dial, nothing's happening, but what's actually happening is you're just scrolling through 4 of the same settings. So just be aware of that it's not your dial, it's just the way we set up the camera. All right, and that's all the settings I use for when I'm just doing general photography. Those settings work pretty well for just about everything, with the exception of maybe very fast sports action type photography. In those cases, you want to use shutter priority and continuous high shutter at 10 frames per second with continuous autofocus. And I may do another video on that with this camera. I know I have it for like the other Olympus cameras, but I haven't done one for this one. And we need to do one more thing, because what I want to do is save everything we just did in the camera, so that if we do make any changes while we're out in the field, we can always go back to that baseline of settings that we just set up. And you do that in the Mysets menu that we saw very early in this video. So let's go into the menu again. So what we need to do is go back into shooting menu number 1, go over here to the Reset Myset menu, click OK, and go to Myset 1, and you can see it says no data, meaning we haven't saved any custom settings. So we'll click over to the right, and we're going to click OK on set, like that. Now everything that is in the camera, all the settings and everything we just set up, have now been saved to Myset 1. So even if I inadvertently change, or intentionally change, say something to this, and we're doing some kind of spot metering, maybe we're doing black and white, and I want to go back to the original settings that we just set up, all I have to do is go into the menu, go into the Reset Myset menu, go to Myset, click OK here, and then say yes, like that. And now you'll see that when we look in the Super Control panel, we're back to our natural color profile, the ESP metering, and silent shutter mode. Now I'm going to go one further. I'm going to go into the button menu. Down here, B for button, and I'm going to program one of the function buttons to be the Myset, so that instead of having to dive in the menu to set that setting or reset my settings to the original settings that I had, all I have to do is just push a button somewhere. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually reprogram the HDR button, because I don't do HDR too much. I do bracketing, but not specifically HDR. So let's go into the button function, and this is function number 4, right? So we're going to go down here to function number 4. You can see it's set to HDR, and I'm going to change this to be Myset number 1. And what I have to do now actually is save this again in the Myset. Say click, go over here to the right and say set. So now this function button has been saved into the Myset as well. So again, if I do something simple like change the picture mode, all I have to do is click the HDR button, and you can see we're back to all of the previous settings that we had saved in the Myset 1. So this will keep you from accidentally resetting your Mysets, because you can see how easy it is to go into Myset, set, and accidentally click set, rather than clicking the OK button here and saying yes. Because if we did this and click set here, we're going to reset the settings to whatever the camera's current state is. Another way you can do this is you can go into the button menu and go to mode dial function, and you can set Myset 1 to the mode dial. So in this case, I'm going to set it to the this collage function here. So now, and then let's save that again into the Myset, like so. So now, instead of pushing the HDR button, I can just turn the mode dial all the way to this collage icon, and now I have all the settings that we had set up. And if you look in the bottom left here, you'll see that we're in aperture priority, which is the setting we saved. And just above that, you'll see that it says My 1 to tell you that you're in the Myset 1 settings. So now, I can pretty much do anything I want. Even go into movie mode, or go into program mode, or to shutter priority mode, take pictures like this. And then if I want to go back to all my original settings, the best way to do it is to just go back into this collage mode, and now we're back into the Myset 1. I prefer this method over using the button method because there can be some conflict sometime with this button versus the functions that you want to do. It's a little complicated for me to explain, but you can try both and see which one works for you. But I found that using the mode button is a little more consistent in workflow when you're out in the field. And speaking of when you're out in the field, sometimes you'll find that you want to change something to your baseline settings, or maybe you forgot to add something when you set up your baseline settings. Like I did today, actually, I forgot to change my aperture and exposure compensation, because right now I saved it at f5.6 with +1 exposure comp. And what I want to do is set that so it's at the maximum aperture of f1.8 and +0 exposure compensation. So let me show you how to do that so you don't have to go through all the different settings. All you have to do is change those two things and resave it. So the best way to do this is really to get out of your Myset. You can go into any other mode, it doesn't really matter, and then put the camera back into your Myset mode, which we programmed to the collage mode on the dial. And you can see now we've returned back to the core settings of the Mysets. And then I'm just going to change the aperture wide open to 1.8 in this case on this lens. Your lens may be different. Like if you're using the kit lens, you may not be able to go down to 1.8. You'll be able to go down to, say, 3.5. And then I'm going to adjust my exposure comp by rotating the front dial so that it's back to 0. And now I want to resave this. So all I have to do is go into the Reset Myset menu, click OK, go down here, click over to the right, and click Set. And now I have the updated aperture and exposure compensation set to what I want it to be. All right, and those are all of the settings that I use and why I use some and don't use others. And I hope you found this video helpful. If so, consider buying me a coffee or making a donation in the links below, because they are greatly appreciated and they help me to continue making videos like this for you. And of course, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, of course, you can always subscribe, hit the bell notification. But either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.